Step right up. Imagine unlocking ancient secrets, like finding a hidden chamber that's been sealed for millennia, or cracking a code that's been silent for centuries.
Mm.
That's kind of the thrill of plunging into early Indian history, especially that vast and complex period after the still somewhat mysterious end of the Harappan civilization.
Right. It wasn't an empty canvas, was it? It was a time when entirely new worlds began to take shape right across the subcontinent.
And piecing together what happened during that long stretch, it really is incredible detective work across centuries.
It is. The Harappan civilization's decline around 1800 BCE, it left a significant gap in terms of, big urban structures spanning maybe 1500 years before the next wave of major states pops up.
Wow, 1,500 years.
But you're right, it wasn't silent time. Seeds were definitely being planted for the next great developments.
And that's precisely where we're setting our sights today. We're diving into a truly pivotal millennium, roughly from 600 BCE to 600 CE,
A huge chunk of time.
a huge chunk. This is the era when early states really solidified. Major empires like the Mauryans rose and then later gave way to new kingdoms, and towns started buzzing with life and trade again.
Mhm.
It's the age of kings, farmers, and towns, and it fundamentally transformed the landscape politically, economically, socially.
It really marks a dramatic shift, doesn't it?
Mhm.
From more regional, varied developments to larger, more integrated systems.
Yeah.
We'll explore the emergence of new forms of political organization, significant changes in how people produce food, and the growth of these complex urban centers linked by really wide-reaching trade networks.
Our guide on this journey isn't like a single narrative, but excerpts from a history text that itself synthesizes a dense stack of primary source material.
Right.
We're talking about voices from the past etched into durable materials, inscriptions carved into stone and metal, ancient texts written on various surfaces that survived, coins unearthed in hoards that tell economic stories, and vivid visual material like sculpture and pottery.
And these sources are our direct link, aren't they? They're our connection to the people of this time. They are fragmented, sometimes biased, absolutely, but they are what we have.
Yeah.
Our mission, really, is to listen carefully to what these sources reveal, understand the key developments they point to, try to get a glimpse of what life might have been like for different people across this long millennium,
Mm-hmm.
and importantly, appreciate the incredible effort and, frankly, ingenuity historians put into piecing this all together.
Exactly. Think of this deep dive as your shortcut to getting a solid handle on this crucial, complex chapter of Indian history.
Right.
Now, it's really important to remember right up front, these sources don't give us a perfect, complete picture. Historians are constantly grappling with fragments, with differing accounts, and with the simple fact that the vast majority of ordinary lives during this period left no lasting written record.
And that inherent limitation is part of the challenge. But honestly, it's also what makes studying this era so compelling.
Yeah, I agree.
We're working with the pieces that survive, learning not just what they say, but how to read between the lines and interpret their silences.
That complexity keeps the field vibrant and the debates ongoing, which is fantastic for learning. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So, picking up after the decline of the Harappan civilization around 1800 BCE, you mentioned there's this long span, like 1,500 years, before the emergence of large states around 600 BCE. What kind of picture do the sources give us of what was happening across the subcontinent during this intervening period? It wasn't just empty space, right?
No, far from it. While we don't see the large integrated urban centers like Harappa, this is a time of really significant regional developments that lay the groundwork for the future.
Okay.
So in the Northwest, specifically the region of the Indus and its tributaries, we see the composition of crucial texts.
Yeah.
This is the period associated with the composition of the Rig Veda,
The Rig Veda.
which is, a foundational text for later Indian religious and cultural tradition. So important literary and cultural activity is taking shape here.
That's a major development in one region. What about other parts of the subcontinent where things happening elsewhere too?
Oh, absolutely. Simultaneously, we see the gradual emergence and spread of agricultural settlements. People are settling down, clearing land, cultivating crops in various parts of North India, extending south into the Deccan Plateau, and even into parts of what is now Karnataka.
So farming is spreading.
It marks a fundamental shift towards settled life and agrarian economies for increasing numbers of people.
And alongside settled agriculture, were there still other ways of life? Nomadic groups?
Definitely. The evidence also indicates the continued presence of pastoral populations, particularly in the Deccan and further south. These are communities whose livelihoods are centered around raising livestock and who might move seasonally with their herds, probably interacting with settled agricultural groups along the way.
Okay. And in Central and South India, we see the appearance of very distinctive structures related to burial practices, these megaliths.
That's right. From the first millennium BCE onwards, a new and really notable mode of disposing of the dead appears: megaliths. These are large stone structures, sometimes very elaborate, built to commemorate the deceased.
What did they look like?
Well, they can take various forms, sometimes stone circles, sometimes dolmens, which are like stone tables, or even rock-cut caves.
And what do these megaliths reveal about the people who built them? What do we find inside?
The burials associated with these megaliths often contain a range of grave goods. Crucially, we find tools and weapons made of iron.
Ah, iron. That's significant.
Hugely significant. It tells us several things. It indicates the increasing use and availability of iron technology during this period in these regions, suggesting people were mastering ironworking.
Right.
And the presence of weapons and tools also offers clues about the material culture, economic activities, and possibly the social status of the people being buried,
Okay.
maybe indicating warriors or artisans, people with specialized skills.
So you have these diverse developments happening concurrently across the subcontinent. The composition of Vedic text in one area, the spread of settled agriculture in others, the continuation of pastoralism, and distinct cultural practices like megalith building appearing elsewhere, often linked to new technologies like iron. This all builds towards a major turning point, though.
Precisely. The 6th century BCE is widely recognized by historians as a period of significant transformation. This is when these diverse regional developments begin to coalesce and accelerate, leading to the visible emergence of what we can call early states and larger kingdoms.
Okay.
There are fundamental changes in the organization of agriculture on a larger scale, probably needed to support growing populations and non-agricultural specialists. And, crucially, this is the period when new towns and cities start appearing and growing across almost the entire subcontinent, becoming centers of political, economic, and cultural activity.
So, the stage is set. We have a diverse backdrop, key regional developments, and then this moment around 600 BCE where things really start to consolidate into larger political and economic units. This sets us up perfectly for the millennium we're diving into.
Absolutely.
Now, as we begin to explore this period of emerging states and towns, so much of our knowledge comes from things people wrote down or carved into durable materials like stone and metal. But for the longest time, those ancient writings were completely unreadable, aren't they?
It's quite a paradox, isn't it, to have historical records but lack the key to unlock them. That was exactly the situation with the earliest inscriptions found across India, which were predominantly written in two scripts, Brahmi and Kharosthi.
Brahmi and Kharosthi. Okay.
These scripts were used extensively, holding invaluable information about rulers, donations, beliefs. But they were a complete mystery for centuries.
Until the 1830s, that's when we see a monumental breakthrough, almost like finding the Rosetta Stone for ancient India, thanks to a remarkable individual named James Prinsep.
James Prinsep, yeah. He was a scholar and an officer in the Mint of the East India Company in Calcutta.
In the Mint. Interesting.
Yeah, so his work involved examining coins, many of which carried these undeciphered inscriptions. He developed a deep fascination with these ancient scripts and really dedicated himself to cracking them.
And how did he manage this incredibly complex task, especially for Brahmi, which, as you mentioned, is the ancestor of so many modern Indian scripts?
For Brahmi, it was a painstaking process of comparative analysis. Prinsep, working with Indian pandits who were knowledgeable about later scripts, compared the forms of letters he saw in the ancient inscriptions with those found in contemporary manuscripts of scripts like Bengali and Devanagari.
So comparing old and new.
Exactly. He looked for patterns, recurring letter shapes, how they might have evolved over time. It was a process of deduction, slowly identifying possible consonant and vowel sounds based on their appearance and frequency. Figure 2.11 in the source material, showing the comparison between Brahmi and Devanagari, gives you a good sense of that visual relationship he was trying to uncover.
So using what was known to figure out the unknown, letter by letter. What about Kharosthi? That script was used more in the Northwest, right?
Yes, Kharosthi was prevalent in the Northwest. Its decipherment involved a slightly different, maybe more fortunate method. This method relied on bilingual coins.
Bilingual coins meaning inscribed in two different languages or scripts?
Exactly. In the Northwest, after Alexander the Great's campaigns, you had these Indo-Greek kings ruling.
Ah.
They issued coins that had their names and sometimes titles written in both Greek, which European scholars could read, and in the local script, which was Kharosti. Figure 2.2 in the source shows one such coin of the Indo-Greek king Menander.
So you could match the names?
Precisely. By comparing the Greek names like Apollodotus or Menander with the corresponding inscriptions in Kharosti on the same coin, Prinsep and other scholars could systematically identify the letters in the Kharosti script, like finding the letter A in both versions of the name.
That's incredibly clever. It provides a direct key. And what did Prinsep discover once he could read the Brahmi inscriptions? What was written on them?
Once he could read Brahmi, Prinsep found that a vast majority of these inscriptions referred to a king by the title Piyadasi,
Piyadasi,
meaning pleasant to behold.
pleasant to behold. Okay. And then came the big historical connection.
Yes, the truly revolutionary discovery came when a few inscriptions that used this title, Piyadasi, also mentioned the name Asoka.
Ahsoka.
This was the crucial link. Asoka was already known from Buddhist texts as a major historical figure, a powerful emperor who supposedly underwent this big transformation.
So deciphering these scripts didn't just unlock the ability to read old carvings. It suddenly linked a prominent figure known from religious and literary traditions to a vast network of contemporary official records spread right across the subcontinent.
It completely revolutionized the study of early Indian political history. Suddenly, scholars had access to primary source material, the actual words or decrees of rulers, allowing them to reconstruct the broad outlines of major dynasties and kingdoms for the first time.
Wow.
Using these inscriptions alongside other sources, like texts in various languages, Prakrit, Pali, Tamil, Sanskrit, and archaeological evidence, they could start mapping the political landscape of this period.
And you mentioned Prakrit was a key language in these early inscriptions.
Yes, the earliest inscriptions, especially Asokan ones, were primarily in Prakrit. And that probably wasn't accidental.
Why Prakrit?
Well, Prakrit was actually a group of languages spoken by ordinary people across different regions. Using Prakrit and inscriptions was likely a deliberate strategy to make the ruler's message potentially accessible to a wider audience than, say, Sanskrit, which was more associated with learned Brahmas and ritual contexts.
Makes sense.
Even famous historical names we know, like Ajatasattu and Asoka, appear in their Prakrit forms in these early records.
So the initial focus after decipherment was very much on establishing the political history, who ruled where and when. What came next for historians studying this period? Did the focus shift?
Yeah, it did. Once that basic political framework was established, particularly by the early 20th century, historians began to shift their focus. They moved beyond just kings and timelines to investigate the deeper connections between these political changes and underlying economic and social developments.
Right.
They wanted to understand how the rise of states and empires impacted agricultural practices, stimulated trade, fostered urban growth, and shaped social structures.
And were those links straightforward cause and effect relationships, like state rises, so trade increases?
Not always. It quickly became clear that the links between political power and economic social changes were complex and multidirectional. It wasn't just the state driving all changes. Economic and social factors also influenced the nature and reach of state power. Understanding this required a deeper, more nuanced approach, looking at all the different types of sources in conversation with each other.
That complexity is what makes it a deep dive, I suppose. But the decipherment was undeniably the essential first step, opening the door to accessing so much primary information about this pivotal era.
Absolutely critical.
So, armed with the ability to read ancient scripts, historians could really dig into the period starting around the 6th century BCE. What does that investigation reveal about the key characteristics of this new era of state formation?
This is indeed a critical period, marked by significant transformations that built upon those earlier regional developments we talked about.
Okay.
We see the definite emergence of early states, often centered around capital cities that were increasingly fortified. There's also a clear increase in the use of iron technology, impacting both agriculture and warfare.
And alongside iron, coinage appears as a major new feature you mentioned.
Yes, the development and growing use of coinage is a hallmark of this period, facilitating economic exchange on a new scale. And perhaps most significantly, this era sees the flourishing of new systems of thought and belief, notably the emergence and spread of Buddhism and Jainism, which had a profound impact on society, ethics, and culture.
And politically, the landscape is dominated by what are known as the Mahajanapadas. Can you explain what these were?
Yeah, early Buddhist and Jaina texts from this period frequently mentions 16 prominent states or kingdoms, referring to them as the Mahajanapadas, literally great Janapadas.
Great Janapadas.
While the specific lists might vary slightly across different texts, certain names appear consistently, indicating their significant power and influence during this time.
What were some of these important ones? The big names.
Prominent examples include states like Vaji, Magadha, Koshala, Kuru, Panchala, Gandhara, and Avanti.
Okay.
The term Janapada itself provides a clue to their nature. It means the land where a Jana, essentially a people, clan, or tribe, has settled its foot. So these were the defined territories controlled by powerful groups or their rulers.
And were all 16 governed in the same way? Were they all kingdoms with kings?
No, and that's one of the fascinating aspects of this period's political landscape. While the majority of the Mahajanapadas were monarchies ruled by a single king,
Right.
some were different. These were known as Ganas or Sanghas, and they were characterized by an oligarchic form of government.
Oligarchies, where power is shared. The source compared it a bit to the Roman Republic, where power wasn't concentrated in one ruler.
That comparison helps, yeah. In these Ganas or Sanghas, political power was shared among a group of men who were often collectively referred to as Rajas, even though they weren't individual monarchs in the same sense as in a monarchy.
Interesting.
Texts mention that both Mahavira, the central figure of Jainism, and the Buddha himself belonged to such Ganas, specifically the Vajrasangha and the Shakyagana, respectively.
Wow. So they weren't minor players.
No, not at all.
God.
This highlights that these were not insignificant entities. They were centers of both political and intellectual activity.
And in these oligarchies, did the group of Rajas control resources collectively, like land?
The sources suggest this was the case in some instances, like the Vajrasangha, where the Rajas might have collectively controlled important resources, such as land. Reconstructing the internal workings and histories of these Ganas and Sanghas is often more difficult than for monarchies, as their records are less numerous.
Right.
However, it's remarkable that some of these oligarchic states managed to endure for nearly 1,000 years, demonstrating a different, enduring model of political organization coexisting with the monarchies.
Regardless of whether they were monarchies or oligarchies, these emerging states needed a base of operations, a capital.
Yes, each Mahajanapada typically had a capital city, and these capitals were often fortified. The construction of fortification walls was a significant undertaking, as seen in visuals from archaeological sites like Rajgir, which was the early capital of Magadha. Figure 2.2 in the source material shows portions of those ancient walls.
Why build such massive walls? Was it purely for defense or something else?
Protection was certainly a primary reason, defending the capital and its inhabitants from attacks by rival states. But fortification walls also served other purposes. They could signal the power and importance of the city and the state, acting as a visual symbol of control and authority. Maintaining these fortified cities, along with nascent armies and administrative systems, required considerable resources.
Okay, so where did these resources come from? How did these early states fund their activities? Armies, walls, administration. It all costs.
From around the 6th century BCE, we see the composition of Sanskrit texts by Brahmanas, known as the Dharma Sutras. These texts prescribe norms and duties, including for rulers who were ideally expected to be Kshatriyas, the warrior class.
And what did these texts say about state revenue? How should kings get money?
The Dharma Sutras advise rulers to collect taxes and tribute from the population, specifically mentioning cultivators, traders, and artisans, essentially, the people who were producing wealth through agriculture, craft, and commerce.
Was this taxation system universally applied? Did everyone pay?
The sources aren't always clear on how consistently resources were procured from groups like pastoralists or forest peoples. That remains an area where our knowledge is more limited.
Okay.
Interestingly, raids on neighboring states were also recognized as a legitimate, albeit perhaps not ideal, means for rulers to acquire wealth and resources.
So warfare was partly an economic activity back then, raiding for riches.
It seems it was often intertwined with the need for resources, yeah.
Yeah.
And as these states grew, some gradually developed more formal institutions.
Like armies and officials.
Some acquired standing armies that were paid and maintained by the state, and developed regular bureaucracies to manage administration, justice, and revenue collection. Others still relied on militia, often recruited from the peasantry, for their military needs.
It paints a picture of a dynamic period where different forms of states were emerging, experimenting with ways to organize, defend themselves, and extract resources from the population, setting the stage for larger political formations.
A real period of political experimentation and consolidation.
Of those 16 Mahajanapadas you mentioned, one state significantly outpaced the others and became the dominant power in the region. Which one was that?
That was Magadha, located in the fertile Gangetic Plain in what is now present-day Bihar. Between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, Magadha grew to become the most powerful of the Mahajanapadas, eventually forming the core of a vast empire.
Magadha. Okay. When modern historians look back, what factors do they point to explain this rise? Why Magadha and not one of the others?
They often highlight a combination of geographical advantages and access to crucial resources. Firstly, the region around Magadha was exceptionally fertile alluvial land.
Good farming land.
Excellent farming land. This supported highly productive agriculture, leading to significant food surpluses, which in turn could support a larger population, including specialists not involved in farming, and generate surplus wealth for the state.
So a strong agricultural base was key. Makes sense.
Absolutely. Secondly, Magadha had the advantage of being located near rich iron mines, particularly in what is now Jharkhand.
Iron again.
This access to iron was incredibly important. It provided resources for crafting more durable and effective agricultural tools, which further boosted production,
Right.
and for forging superior weapons and armor, giving Magadha a significant military advantage over rivals who might have had less access to iron.
And they had a military asset unique to the region, didn't they? Something big.
Elephants. The forests in the Magadha region were home to elephants. These animals were incorporated into the Magadhan army and became a formidable component, capable of breaking through enemy lines and causing chaos.
Wow. War elephants.
Made the Magadhan army particularly effective.
And access to transportation and communication? Was that important?
Hugely. The Ganga River and its tributaries flowed through the heart of Magha. These rivers provided cheap, efficient, and convenient routes for communication and transportation, whether moving troops quickly to different areas or transporting goods and resources across the kingdom. This connectivity was a major logistical advantage.
So modern historians emphasize these environmental and geographic factors. Fertile land, mineral resources like iron, military assets like elephants, and riverine connectivity. But early writers had a different perspective, didn't they? They focused more on the rulers.
They did. Early Buddhist and Jaina writers, who witnessed or recounted Magadha's rise, often attributed its power more directly to the qualities and policies of its rulers and their ministers.
Focusing on leadership rather than geography.
Exactly. They highlighted kings like Bimbisara, Ajatasattu, often portrayed as ruthlessly ambitious, and Mahapadmananda, describing them as powerful, determined rulers and their ministers as effective and cunning strategists.
So for them, it was about the people in charge.
From their perspective, the power of Magadha stemmed from the capabilities and decisive actions of these key individuals.
That's a fascinating contrast in explanations environmental determinism versus the agency of individuals. Which explanation do you think holds more weight? Is it one or the other?
Oh, it's rarely a simple case of one or the other in history. It's most likely that both sets of factors were crucial.
A combination.
I think so. The rich environmental and resource base provided the potential for dominance. But it took ambitious, capable, and sometimes ruthless rulers and their effective ministers to leverage those resources, to organize armies, implement policies, and conduct the raids and conquests necessary to build a powerful state. The debate itself, as highlighted in the source material, is a great example of how historians weigh different types of evidence and explanations to understand complex historical phenomena.
Magadha's power is also reflected in the strategic choices they made about their capital city. They moved it, didn't they?
Yes, they had a shift. Initially, the capital was Rajagaha, meaning House of the King, which is present-day Rajgir.
Rajgir, okay.
It was a fortified settlement nestled amongst hills, offering natural defensive advantages, as we saw with the fortification walls in Figure 2.2.
A smart initial choice for security.
Right. But later, in the 4th century BCE, the capital was moved north to Pataliputra, which is present-day Patna.
Pataliputra Patna. Why move?
This was another highly strategic move. Pataliputra was located at the confluence of rivers, giving the state control over the crucial communication and trade routes along the Ganga River. This shift consolidated Magadha's control over the economic heartland of the Gangetic Plain.
So Magadha's rise wasn't simply about geography. It was about geography combined with effective strategic decision-making by its rulers, laying the groundwork for something even larger.
Exactly. It set the stage for the First Great Empire.
The growth of Magadha ultimately culminated in the emergence of the first major empire we see in the subcontinent during this period.
That's the Mauryan Empire, which arose from the foundations laid by Magadha and grew to encompass a vast territory, arguably the largest political entity seen in the subcontinent up to that point.
And who are the key figures associated with the Mauryan Empire? Who were the main rulers?
The empire was founded by Chandragupta Maurya around 321 BCE. He is credited with expanding Mauryan control significantly, even extending into parts of present-day Afghanistan and Baluchistan in the northwest.
Chandragupta, the founder.
However, perhaps the most celebrated and well-known ruler of this dynasty was his grandson, Asoka, who reigned from approximately 207 to 268 to 231 BCE.
The same Asoka whose name was key to deciphering the Brahmi script.
Exactly. Asoka's reign is particularly significant. He expanded the empire further by conquering Kalinga, the coastal region of present-day Orissa, an event that, as we'll see, had a profound impact on him, according to his own inscriptions.
How do historians manage to reconstruct the history of such a vast and ancient empire? What kind of sources do they have to work with? It must be a mix.
Historians are fortunate to have a truly remarkable variety of sources for the Mauryan period, allowing for cross-validation and richer understanding. Archaeological finds are important, providing material evidence of the period's culture, economy, and power structures.
Like pottery or buildings.
Yes, and the stone sculpture from this era, particularly the famous lion capital from Sarnath, figure 2.3, is iconic.
Ah, yes, the lion capital that's so recognizable today, the emblem of India. Why is that particular piece of sculpture so significant?
Well, the lion capital is not only a masterpiece of ancient Indian art, known for its polished finish and dynamic animal figures, but it also served as a key symbol of the Mauryan state's power and authority, placed atop Asokan pillars.
Right.
Its adoption as the national emblem of modern India highlights its enduring cultural and historical significance, connecting contemporary India back to this powerful early empire.
What other types of sources contribute to our understanding? Written sources.
Yes, we have contemporary accounts, although some survive only in fragments. Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador sent to Chandragupta Maurya's court by the Seleucid ruler Seleucus Mauregator, wrote an account called Indica.
Indica, okay.
It provides valuable, albeit sometimes filtered through a foreign perspective, observations on the Mauryan administration and society. There's also the Arthashastra,
The famous Arthashastra.
a major treatise on statecraft, economics, and military strategy, traditionally attributed to Kautilya, or Chanakya, believed to have been a key minister of Chandragupta. While parts of the Arthashastra might be later additions, it offers significant insights into the theory and practice of Mauryan governance.
Are there literary sources as well? Later texts?
Yes, the Mauryas are mentioned in a variety of later literary works, including Buddhist, Jaina, and Puranic texts, as well as classical Sanskrit literature. While these texts provide context and later perspectives, they were written centuries after the Mauryan period and need careful handling by historians.
Right, they're looking back.
Exactly.
And among all these, you mentioned one type of source is considered the most valuable. Which one is that?
Without question, the most valuable sources for the Mauryan period are the inscriptions of Asoka himself, found on rocks and polished stone pillars throughout his empire.
The inscriptions again.
Asoka was truly unique in the history of the subcontinent. Up to that point, he was the first ruler to directly address his subjects and officials by carving his messages onto stone surfaces.
So these inscriptions are like direct public announcements from the emperor. Amazing.
Exactly. And he used them primarily to proclaim his understanding and principles of Dhamma.
Dhamma. What were the key principles of this Dhamma, as described in his inscriptions? Was it a religion?
Asoka's Dhamma wasn't about promoting a specific religious sect. Not exactly. Instead, it was a set of ethical principles and guidelines for social behavior that he believed would promote well-being in this world and the next.
Okay, like a code of conduct.
Kind of. These principles included showing deep respect towards elders, being generous towards religious figures like brahmanas and those who had renounced worldly life, treating slaves and servants kindly, and showing tolerance and respect for the religions and traditions of others.
Principles aimed at fostering social harmony and ethical conduct across a diverse empire. That makes sense.
Precisely. The inscriptions give us a direct window into the moral and administrative philosophy Asoka sought to implement and disseminate throughout his vast territory.
Administering an empire that stretched from Afghanistan to Orissa and parts of the Deccan must have been incredibly complex. How did they manage it? How is it structured?
The Asokan inscriptions themselves provide clues about the administrative structure. They mentioned 5 major political centers: the imperial capital Pataliputra, and 4 provincial centers located strategically across the empire: Taxila in the northwest,
Axially.
Ujjaini in central India, Tosali in Kalinga, Orissa, and Savarnagiri in the south. If you look at map 2, which shows the distribution of Asokan inscriptions, you can see how these centers are spread across the empire.
Was the administration uniform across this entire massive territory? Was it run the same way everywhere?
Historians today generally believe that uniform administration across such diverse regions ranging from mountainous areas in Afghanistan to coastal plains in Orissa would have been practically impossible.
Too varied.
Too varied. Administrative control was likely strongest in the core regions around the capital and the provincial centers.
Why were those provincial centers chosen in those specific locations? Taxila, Ujjaini.
They were selected with strategic considerations in mind. Taxila and Ujjaini, for example, were important commercial centers located on major long-distance land trade routes.
Trade routes.
Suvarnagiri, which translates to the Golden Mountain in present-day Karnataka, was likely chosen because of its proximity to gold mines, which would have been economically vital for the empire.
Gold mines, okay. Communication across this vast distance must have been incredibly important, but also very challenging. Getting messages, moving troops.
Absolutely vital, and a major logistical hurdle. Communication along both land and riverine roads was the nervous system of the empire. Journeys between the capital and distant provincial centers could take weeks or even months.
Weeks or months.
Yeah, this necessitated elaborate arrangements for providing supplies and protection for those traveling, whether they were officials, messengers, or troops. This is where the army played a crucial role in maintaining order and connectivity.
You mentioned Megasthenes' account gives details about the Marian army organization, Source 1. What does he describe? Was it well organized?
According to Megasthenes, yes, very highly organized. He describes a military administration overseen by a committee of 30 officials, divided into 6 subcommittees, each with specific responsibilities.
6 subcommittees. For what?
These subcommittees managed the navy, transport and provisions, foot soldiers, horses, chariots, and elephants.
Covering all the bases. The subcommittee for transport and provisions sounds particularly complex. What did they do?
It does. According to Megasthenes, this subcommittee was responsible for a wide array of tasks, arranging for bullock carts to carry military equipment and supplies, procuring food for the soldiers, ensuring fodder for the animals, and even recruiting servants and artisans to accompany and support the army on the march.
Wow. That's logistics.
It gives you a real sense of the intricate logistics required to move and sustain a large force in the ancient world.
And the Greek sources estimate the size of this army was staggering: 600,000 foot soldiers, 30,000 cavalry, 9,000 elephants. The source notes some historians consider these numbers exaggerated, but if they were even close to accurate.
If those numbers are even broadly indicative, imagine the sheer scale of resources a Mauryan ruler would have needed to feed, equip, pay, and maintain such a massive military force.
Huge.
It would have required an exceptionally efficient and extensive system of resource extraction, collection, and management distributed across the empire. It highlights the immense power and organizational capacity concentrated in the hands of the ruler to command such resources.
Beyond military might and administrative centers, how else did Ashoka attempt to unify and control this vast and diverse empire? You mentioned Dhamma.
He also sought to hold the empire together through the propagation of his Dhamma. As part of this effort, he appointed special officers called Dhamma Mahamata.
Dhamma Mamata.
Their role was to travel throughout the empire, spreading the message of Dhamma, interpreting its principles, and perhaps intervening in disputes to ensure its application, like moral officers almost.
And you mentioned the languages and scripts used in his inscriptions earlier. That was part of the strategy, too.
Yes, this was also part of the strategy to reach diverse populations. Most Ashokan inscriptions were in Prakrit using the Brahmi script, which was widely understood across different regions. Right. However, in the northwest parts of the empire, which bordered Central Asia and the Greek world, inscriptions were also found in Aramaic and Greek scripts. For Prakrit language inscriptions in that specific northwest region, the Kharoshthi script was used.
Multiple scripts for different regions.
Using multiple languages and scripts demonstrates an awareness of the linguistic diversity of the empire and an effort to communicate effectively with different groups.
It really does sound like an incredibly sophisticated and ambitious undertaking to build and govern an empire of that scale in the ancient world.
A truly remarkable achievement for its time.
Given the impressive picture painted by the sources, the vastness of the empire, the administrative complexity, Ashoka's unique form of communication through Dhamma, how important was the Mauryan Empire in the overall sweep of Indian history? How do historians view it now?
That's a really interesting question, and the perspective has shifted over time. When historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries first began piecing together this history, often working under colonial rule,
Right.
the discovery and reconstruction of the Mauryan Empire was seen as a truly momentous landmark. The very idea that such a large, apparently unified empire existed in early India was incredibly exciting, and in some ways it challenged prevalent colonial notions about India's past being fragmented or lacking large-scale political organization.
So it was seen as evidence of early Indian grandeur.
Exactly, and the archaeological finds seem to reinforce this view of a grand empire. The discovery of impressive stone sculpture, like the lion capital we discussed, was interpreted as typical of spectacular imperial art. These finds seem to fit perfectly with the image of a powerful and culturally sophisticated empire.
And Ashoka himself was seen as a remarkable figure, wasn't he? A great king.
Absolutely. Ashoka's message of Dhamma in his inscriptions seemed to portray a ruler who was not only powerful and hardworking, but also unusually humble compared to later rulers who adopted increasingly grand titles. This image resonated strongly with Indian nationalist leaders in the 20th century,
Ah, see.
who saw Ashoka's reign as a kind of golden age and an inspiring precedent for a unified India.
So for a significant period, the Mauryan Empire was viewed by many historians as the defining, foundational moment of early Indian political history.
That was certainly the dominant narrative for a long time. However, from the mid-20th century onwards, historians began to take a more critical approach, reevaluating the Mauryan period's importance within the broader, longer history of the subcontinent.
Okay, how did they reevaluate? What questions did they start asking?
They began to question its overall duration and extent. For one, the Mauryan Empire lasted only about 150 years.
150 years. That's not actually that long in the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. While significant in the vast millennia of Indian history, that's not an exceptionally long lifespan for a political entity.
And its geographical reach, while large, wasn't total, you mentioned.
Correct. Looking at Map 2, it's clear that the empire, while vast, did not encompass the entire subcontinent. Important areas in the Deep South, for instance, including the regions of the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas in Tamilakam, as well as parts of present-day Kerala, remained outside Mauryan control.
So it wasn't pan-Indian.
No. And the distribution of Ashokan inscriptions itself, primarily within the delineated empire, suggests that the ruler's writ didn't extend beyond these boundaries. You wouldn't expect a ruler to carve official decrees in territory they didn't control.
Makes sense. And even within the borders, was control always uniform? Was it equally strong everywhere?
That's another crucial point historians consider. It's highly likely that administrative control was strongest in the core areas around the capital and the major provincial centers. As you moved into more peripheral or geographically challenging areas, the direct control of the imperial administration likely lessened considerably.
So the picture shifts from a uniformly controlled megastate to something perhaps more nuanced, with varying degrees of influence and control across its territory, like ripples in a pond, strongest near the center.
Exactly. A good analogy. And importantly, the period following the decline of the Mauryan Empire around the 2nd century BCE wasn't a vacuum.
Right.
It saw the rapid emergence of new chiefdoms and kingdoms in various parts of the subcontinent, including the regions that had been part of the Mauryan Empire and those that hadn't. This demonstrates that state formation was an ongoing process happening in different regions, driven by local factors as well, and not solely initiated or dependent on the Mauryan state.
So while undeniably a significant early empire that achieved remarkable scale and sophistication, the Mauryan period is now viewed as an important phase within a much longer, more complex and diverse history of state formation and development in early India, rather than the sole origin point.
Precisely. It's a key chapter, but not the whole book.
With the decline of the Mauryan Empire around the 2nd century BCE, we see the rise of new centers of power across the subcontinent, particularly in the Deccan and further south. What happens then?
Yes, the political landscape becomes more fragmented again, but it's a period of vibrant new kingdoms and chiefdoms emerging. In the Deccan and parts of western India, we see the rise of the Satavahanas.
Satavahanas, okay.
And in the northwest and western India, groups like the Shakas, who are of Central Asian origin, established powerful kingdoms.
Shakas. Central Asian origin. Interesting.
Yes. And further south in Tamilakam, the ancient Tamil country, roughly encompassing parts of present-day Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu, stable and prosperous chiefdoms like those of the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas flourished.
Cholas, Cheras, Pandyas, famous names from the south. How do we learn about these southern chiefdoms? What are the sources?
A crucial source is the early Tamil Sangam texts. These are collections of poems composed by bards and poets, which vividly describe the lives and activities of the chiefs.
Poems, so not official records, but literature.
Literature, yes, but incredibly valuable. They detail how these chiefs acquired resources and, importantly, how they distributed them among their supporters and followers.
The source material highlights a distinction between chiefs and kings. What's the core difference? How did a chief operate compared to a king?
It's mainly about the nature of power and how they got resources. A chief is a powerful figure, often a leader in war and rituals, who maintains control and status through kin support and personal relationships. Their position might be hereditary, but often relies heavily on their ability to lead and gather support.
Okay.
A key difference from a king is that a chief typically relies on gifts brought by people to maintain his status and provide resources, rather than collecting regular taxes from his subjects like a king with a bureaucracy would.
Gifts, not taxes.
And chiefdoms generally also lack the elaborate standing armies and bureaucratic officials that characterize a kingdom.
So chiefs accumulated wealth and loyalty by receiving gifts and then redistributing them, like hosting big feasts or giving rewards.
Exactly. Source 3, the excerpt from the Tamil epic Silappatikaram, provides a wonderful example of this. It describes various groups of people bringing gifts to the Pandya chiefs in Gutavam.
And the list of gifts is quite specific. Ivory, fragrant woods, spices like pepper and cardamom, medicinal plants, fruits, animals like tigers and elephants.
It paints a vivid picture, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Of the resources available to a chief and the diversity of the people acknowledging his authority. People brought these gifts as a form of tribute or homage, demonstrating their loyalty and recognizing his power.
Right.
In return, the chief would use these resources to maintain his household, fund feasts and rituals, reward loyal warriors and poets, and perhaps store or trade surpluses. It's a system based on reciprocal relationships and the flow of wealth upwards in the form of gifts and downwards in the form of redistribution, rather than a formal taxation system.
So, after the Mauryans, we see these powerful chiefdoms in the south, based on gift exchange, and kingdoms like the Satavahanas and Shakas elsewhere. The source mentions these rulers often derived revenue from long-distance trade. That sounds different from relying just on land tax.
That's right. Groups like the Satavahanas and Shakas controlled territories along major trade routes, benefiting significantly from the movement of goods and people. They could levy tolls or taxes on trade, providing a substantial source of revenue that complemented or even supplanted revenue from agriculture in some areas.
Interesting.
The sources also point out that the social origins of many of these new ruling families, including the Satavahanas and Shakas, were often somewhat obscure compared to the long-established lineages claimed by earlier groups.
Not necessarily coming from traditional Kshatriya backgrounds, the warrior class.
Not always clear from the text, yeah. Once they acquired power, they often sought ways to legitimize their rule and claim higher social status within the prevailing social hierarchy. The source notes that we'll see more about how the Satavahanas did this in Chapter 3, hinting at these ongoing efforts to consolidate not just political but also social power.
One striking strategy for claiming high status, especially for rulers with potentially obscure origins, was associating themselves with the divine, making themselves seem godlike.
This strategy is perhaps best exemplified by the Kushanas, who rose to prominence around the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE.
The Kushanas.
They established a large kingdom that stretched from Central Asia into northwest India. Their history is pieced together from a combination of inscriptions and textual traditions.
And how did the Kushanas project this divine connection? How did they show it?
They did this very visibly through their coinage and monumental sculpture. Colossal statues of Kushana rulers have been discovered in shrines, such as one at Mat near Mathura in Uttar Pradesh.
Statues and shrines, like temples.
Yeah, and similar statues have been found in a shrine in Afghanistan. Figure 2.5 shows a sandstone sculpture of a Kushana king from Mathura. Notice the elaborate clothing, the stiff posture, the scale. It's all intended to convey majesty and power, something beyond human.
Installing their statues in shrines, that certainly suggests they wanted to be seen as more than just human rulers.
It strongly suggests that.
Yeah.
Many Kushana rulers adopted titles that explicitly linked them to the divine, most famously Divaputra, meaning son of God.
Divaputra, son of God.
This practice might have been influenced by rulers in China, who referred to themselves as sons of heaven. Figure 2.4, a Kushana coin of Kaniska, visually reinforces this connection. One side shows the king, while the reverse often depicts various deities from different religious traditions, implying the king's association with or patronage of the divine realm.
Why do you think claiming divine status was such an effective strategy for these rulers? What did it achieve?
Well, claiming divine status provided a powerful source of legitimacy, especially for rulers who were outsiders or whose claim to power wasn't based on long-standing hereditary lines within the local system.
Right.
It elevated them above ordinary mortals, instilled awe and perhaps fear, discouraged dissent by making opposition seem sacrilegious, and helped consolidate loyalty by associating their rule with sacred authority. It was a way to project authority that transcended mere military strength or administrative capacity, particularly useful when ruling over diverse populations with varying loyalties.
So after the relatively centralized model of the Mauryans, we see a variety of political formations emerging from powerful chiefdoms in the south based on gift exchange to kingdoms in the north and west relying on trade and divine claims. What about the emergence of larger states later on, like the Gupta Empire? Did they go back to a Mauryan model?
By the 4th century CE, we do see the rise of larger territorial states again, with the Gupta Empire being a prominent example. However, the structure of Gupta rule appears to have been different from the Mauryan model.
How so?
The Guptas seem to have relied more heavily on Samantas.
Samantas. Who are these people?
Samantas were powerful, kind of semi-autonomous individuals or lineages who maintained themselves using local resources, often controlling land within their territories. They weren't typically direct officials paid from the central treasury in the same way as the Mauryan bureaucracy might have been, more like powerful local lords.
What was their relationship with the Gupta emperors? Were they independent?
No, they owed allegiance to the Gupta rulers. They offered homage, paid respects, and provided military support when needed. In return, they were allowed to maintain their local power base and control over resources. This created a dynamic power structure where the central ruler's authority was, to some extent, mediated through these regional power holders.
This sounds like a more decentralized system compared to the Mauryans. Less direct control from the center.
It does suggest that, it suggests the system where power was distributed among the emperor and these powerful regional intermediaries. The relationship was often fluid. Powerful Samantas could challenge a weak emperor and potentially declare their independence or even become kings themselves.
Right.
While a strong emperor could keep the Samantas subordinate.
How do historians learn about the Gupta rulers and their empire? What sources do we have for them?
Our knowledge of the Guptas comes from a variety of sources, including literature, coins, some quite spectacular, as seen in figure 2.9.
Gold coins.
Yes, beautiful gold coins. Also other inscriptions, and crucially, prashastis.
Prashastis, you mentioned those. What exactly is a prashasti again?
A prashasti is a specific type of inscription, usually composed in Sanskrit, that is essentially a eulogy, a text written in praise of a king or other patron. They were typically composed by court poets or learned individuals.
So they are inherently biased, intended to glorify the ruler, like propaganda almost.
Precisely. They are not neutral historical accounts. They are panegyrics meant to extol the ruler's virtues, achievements, and conquests. The Prayaga Prashasti, also known as the Allahabad Pillar inscription, is perhaps the most famous example from the Gupta period, source 4.
Okay.
It was composed in elegant Sanskrit by Harishina, the court poet of Samudragupta, who was arguably the most powerful Gupta ruler in the 4th century CE.
The description of Samudragupta in that Prashasti is quite extraordinary, isn't it? The source gives excerpts.
It is. Harishena describes Samudragupta in incredibly laudatory terms, portraying him as an ideal, invincible ruler. He's called, without an antagonist on earth, someone whose fame wiped off the fame of other kings.
Wow.
He's compared to the supreme being, Purusha, described as incomprehensible, yet captured by devotion and humility. He's the compassionate giver of cows, devoted to the uplift of the miserable and poor, resplendent with kindness, and equal to the great Hindu deities like Kubera, god of wealth, Varuna, god of the ocean, Indra, king of the gods, and Yama, god of death.
That's incredibly high praise, elevating the king to near divine status, just like the Kushanas tried to do.
It is. And this illustrates a key challenge for historians using sources like Prashastis. Historians are looking for factual information about political events, administrative structures, the extent of the empire.
Right, the facts.
But the poets who composed these texts And the audience who read or heard them likely valued them as works of literature and poetry as much as, or more than, as literal historical truth.
So you can't just take these descriptions at face value. You have to read them critically.
Absolutely not. Historians must critically analyze Prashastis, recognizing their purpose is to glorify. They compare the claims made at a Prashasti with information from other, less biased sources, coins, other inscriptions, foreign accounts, to try and reconstruct a more balanced picture of the ruler's actual power, conquests, and administration. It requires careful interpretation and triangulation of evidence.
It really highlights the complex, often subjective nature of historical evidence and the historian's job in interpreting it carefully.
Well,
So far, our discussion has focused heavily on rulers, states, empires, and the elite perspective, as seen through inscriptions and courtly texts like Prashastis. But what about the vast majority of the population, the farmers, artisans, and ordinary people who lived through these transformations? Can we hear their voices?
that's the fundamental challenge, isn't it? Especially when studying ancient history. It's very difficult to know what ordinary subjects truly thought about their rulers, their lives, or the changes happening around them, primarily because ordinary people in this period rarely left behind their own written records or accounts.
So, how do historians even begin to get a sense of their lives or perspectives? Where do you look?
Historians try to gain insights by examining stories and narratives that circulated among the population and were later compiled into anthologies. Collections like the Jatakas and the Panchatantra are particularly valuable here.
The Jataka tales.
Yes. These stories likely originated as oral tales before being written down, and while they are literary, they often contain glimpses of social relations, economic activities, and attitudes towards authority that might reflect popular perspectives. The Jatakas, for instance, were compiled in Pali around the middle of the first millennium CE and are tales about the previous lives of the Buddha.
The Ganda-Tindu Jataka story, described in the source material, offers a vivid, albeit perhaps exaggerated, picture of the potential relationship between rulers and the ruled. What does it say?
It does. This story tells of a wicked king whose subjects suffered immensely due to his misrule. Elderly people, cultivators, farmers, herders, even young boys and animals were said to curse him.
Cursing the king?
They complained of being attacked by robbers at night, suggesting a breakdown of law and order, and harassed by tax collectors during the day, highlighting the burden placed upon them by the state's demand for resources.
Robbers at night, tax collectors by day. Sounds miserable.
Exactly. And the suffering was so severe that people resorted to drastic measures. The story recounts that people became so miserable that they abandoned their village and fled to the forest to escape the oppression.
They just left. Wow. This narrative, while a story, likely reflects a real underlying tension in the relationship between the state and its rural population, doesn't it?
I think it must. A strained relationship driven by the state's constant need for resources. Kings and states were always seeking to increase their revenue to fund their armies, capitals, and administration, and this often translated into demands for higher taxes or tribute from the rural agricultural population.
Right.
For peasants, these demands could be oppressive, and the stories suggest that abandoning land and fleeing was, for some, a desperate alternative to enduring constant harassment and exploitation.
So, on one hand, rulers were demanding more resources, which meant more taxes. On the other hand, they also needed agricultural production to increase to make those taxes possible. How did they try to boost production? What strategies were used?
That's the other side of the coin. Alongside demanding taxes, strategies were widely adopted to increase agricultural output to meet the growing demand from states and towns.
One major strategy was the spread of plow agriculture, especially with iron tools you mentioned earlier.
Yes, from around the 6th century BCE, we see the increasing use and spread of the iron-tipped plowshare. This technology was particularly effective in breaking up the heavy, fertile alluvial soil in areas like the Ganga and Kaveri river valleys.
Okay.
In high rainfall regions, especially, the iron plow allowed for more intensive cultivation, including the widespread adoption of transplantation for paddy, rice.
Transplantation, that's where you grow seedlings in a nursery and then replant them in the flooded fields.
That's right. This technique dramatically increased the yield of rice. However, as the source notes, it was also incredibly backbreaking work for the cultivators. It significantly increased productivity, but came at a high human labor cost.
Was the iron plow adopted everywhere? Did everyone start using it?
No, the adoption of the iron plowshare was uneven across the subcontinent. In semi-arid regions, it wasn't always the most suitable tool, and wasn't widely adopted until much later. And in hilly and central India, which had different terrain and soil types, people continued to rely on hoe agriculture, which was better suited to the local conditions.
So, different tools for different places. What other strategies were used to improve agriculture besides the plow?
Irrigation was crucial. The construction and use of wells and tanks were common, and in some areas, larger-scale canals were also built.
Who built these? The state
Yeah.
or local people?
Both, it seems. These irrigation works were sometimes organized by communities themselves, pooling labor and resources. But increasingly, powerful individuals, including kings, sponsored and organized these large-scale irrigation projects.
Right.
Rulers often recorded the construction or repair of irrigation works in inscriptions, perhaps to demonstrate their commitment to the welfare of their subjects or, to highlight their role in boosting agricultural productivity and thus state revenue.
The Sudarshana Lake example, source 5, is a remarkable illustration of this and how these efforts span different dynasties over centuries.
It really is. The Sudarshana Lake was an artificial reservoir in Gujarat. We know its history from a detailed rock inscription in Sanskrit from the 2nd century CE, commissioned by the Shaka ruler Rudradaman.
A Shaka ruler, okay. And the inscription traces the lake's origins back even further.
Yes. It mentions that the reservoir was originally constructed by a local governor during the rule of the Mauryas, centuries before Rudradaman.
Wow.
It then recounts how a terrible storm damaged the embankments. Rudradaman claims he had the lake repaired, highlighting that he did this using his own treasury resources, specifically stating he did not impose any extra tax or forced labor on his subjects for the repairs.
That sounds like a ruler very conscious of how he would be perceived, emphasizing his generosity. I paid for it myself, no extra taxes.
It certainly does. And the story of the lake doesn't end there. Another inscription found on the same rock from the 5th century CE mentions a Gupta ruler repairing the lake yet again.
So Mauryan, Shaka, Gupta. This lake was important for centuries.
This vital piece of irrigation infrastructure was maintained and repaired by multiple dynasties over centuries, highlighting its long-term importance.
Why did rulers, whether Shaka or Gupta, invest in and make arrangements for irrigation like this? What was in it for them?
It was fundamentally linked to resources and political stability. Reliable irrigation increased agricultural productivity, ensuring more consistent and higher yields.
More food.
Higher yields meant the state could collect more in taxes or tribute from the increased produce. Investing in irrigation was a way for rulers to strengthen the economic base of their kingdom, ensure the well-being, or at least the productivity of their peasant population, and thereby consolidate their own power and wealth. It was a strategic investment in the kingdom's most fundamental resource, its agricultural land and the labor on it.
While these strategies boosted overall production in some areas, it sounds like the benefits weren't shared equally among the rural population. Did everyone get richer?
That's a crucial point revealed by the sources. Probably not. The increased production and the nature of land control led to growing social differentiation within rural society. Buddhist texts, for instance, categorize people engaged in agriculture into distinct groups.
Right.
Landless agricultural laborers, small peasants who owned and cultivated their own land, and large landholders who controlled significant amounts of land and likely employed others.
So a hierarchy emerges. Landless, small farmers, big landowners.
Pretty much. And the term Gahapati comes up in these texts.
Gahapati, what does that mean?
Yes, Gahapati is a significant term in Pali texts. It literally means the owner or head of household. A Gahati was someone who exercised authority and control over the people residing within their household, including their wives and children, but also their slaves and hired workers.
Okay.
Crucially, they also controlled the household's resources, particularly land, livestock, and tools. Sometimes the term Gahapati was also used more broadly as a marker of social status, indicating a wealthy or influential individual even in urban areas.
So within villages, some people were accumulating more land and power, these Gahapatis.
Absolutely. The large landholders and hereditary village headmen, who might have been Gahapatis themselves, became powerful figures who exercised control over smaller peasants and agricultural laborers. They likely had better access to resources like land, labor, capital, perhaps from surplus production or trade, and the new technologies like the iron plow.
Early Tamil literature also reflects these social divisions in rural society, doesn't it?
Yes, the Sangam texts from Tamilakam also categorize the village population based on their relationship to land. They mention terms like velar for large landowners, Ojvar for plowmen, likely small peasants or tenants, and adamai for slaves, agricultural laborers. These terms highlight that social stratification was a widespread phenomenon in rural areas across the subcontinent, based largely on unequal access to and control over land and labor.
With land being so central to wealth and power, disputes over its ownership and boundaries must have been common. How did they deal with that?
Oh, very common, you'd imagine. Control over land became a critical issue, leading to disputes that are even discussed in legal texts from the period. The Manusmriti, a well-known legal text compiled between the 2nd century BCE and 2nd century CE, gives advice to the king on how to resolve boundary disputes between villages.
What sort of advice did it offer? How do you prove where a boundary is?
It suggests that the king, or his appointed officials, should rely on concealed boundary markers that had been buried at the intersections of village boundaries.
Concealed markers, what kind?
These markers were ordinary things like stones, bones, cow's hair, chaff, ashes, pottery shards, coal, pebbles, and sand buried in jars or hidden underground.
Burying bones or ashes as markers. That seems incredibly fragile for markers that might be needed centuries later to resolve a dispute. How would you even find them again?
It does, doesn't it? It gives you a sense of the methods attempted, perhaps intended to be rediscovered through digging, and combined with the testimony of elderly villagers or local knowledge. But it also underscores the potential for ongoing ambiguity and conflict over land boundaries, despite the legal prescriptions. It highlights that even seemingly simple issues like property lines were complex to manage.
Another major development that reshaped the countryside was the emergence of the practice of land grants, kings giving away land.
This practice became increasingly significant from the early centuries CE onwards. Rulers and other powerful individuals began granting land, often whole villages, to religious institutions or to brahmanas. These grants were typically recorded in inscriptions to create a permanent record.
And these inscriptions were often on copper plates, the source mentions.
Yes, copper plates became a common medium for recording land grants, like the one shown in Figure 2.13. These plates served as the legal title deed for the recipient, providing proof of their right to the land and the associated income.
More durable than palm leaf, I suppose.
Exactly. While some early grants were on stone, copper plates were particularly useful for recording these private transactions and could be easily stored and transported by the recipient.
Who typically received these grants? Why were they giving land away?
Grants were most often given to religious institutions, temples or monasteries, or to brahmanas, the priestly class. This practice was seen as highly meritorious, accumulating religious merit for the donor, whether they were a king, a queen, or a wealthy individual. It was a form of religious patronage.
And were the inscriptions always in Sanskrit?
Initially, the land grant inscriptions were predominantly in Sanskrit. However, from around the 7th century CE onwards, while some parts might remain in Sanskrit, large portions of the inscription began to appear in local languages like Tamil or Telugu.
Reflecting local languages becoming more prominent.
It reflected the growing importance of regional languages, and perhaps the need for the grant details to be understood by the local population and officials involved.
The case of Prabhavati-Gupta, source 8, regarding land grants is particularly intriguing. It raises questions about legal norm and reality, especially concerning women and land ownership.
It is a fascinating example. Prabhavati-Gupta was a very influential woman. She was the daughter of the powerful Gupta ruler Chandragupta II and was married into the Vakataka ruling family in the Deccan.
A powerful connection.
Her inscription records her granting land specifically, the village of Danguna, to a teacher named Acharya Channalaswamin.
But the source points out that Sanskrit legal texts generally didn't allow women to have independent control over land, so how could she grant it?
Exactly. Texts like the Manusmriti generally state that women should not have independent access to or control over property, including land. So, Prabhavati-Gupta's ability to grant land raises important questions for historians. Was her case an exception because she was a queen, a member of two powerful ruling dynasties?
Maybe royal women had different rules.
Perhaps. Or does it suggest that the legal norms laid down in the texts were not always uniformly applied in practice, perhaps depending on social status, regional customs, or political influence? Maybe the law said one thing, but reality was different for powerful women.
What else does the Danguna inscription tell us about the nature of these land grants and life in the villages? It sounds quite detailed.
The inscription is remarkably detailed. It's addressed to the villagers of Danguna, listing them as householders, peasants, brahmanas, and others, and instruct them that they must obey the new lord of the village, the recipient of the grant, and provide him with all the produce and dues that they had previously given to the king.
So the villagers just got a new boss, basically.
Essentially, yes. And it lists a whole series of specific exemptions granted to this village. This is where we get a concrete sense of power and rights transferred. The village was granted as an agrahara, meaning land granted to a brahmana, which was typically exempt from royal taxes and dues.
Agrahara.
Okay. The inscription spells out what the villagers no longer owe the king, but now owe the grantee. The village is not to be entered by soldiers or police.
Wow.
They are exempt from providing various goods for the king's touring officers,
Mhm.
like grass, hides, charcoal, exempt from certain royal rights within the village, like the right to buy liquor, dig for salt, access mines or specific trees like Kadira, and exempt from supplying things like flowers or milk. Crucially, the grant includes the right to collect hidden treasures and deposits found in the village and all taxes.
Wow. That list of exemptions and rights gives the new landholder immense economic and administrative power over the villagers. They've essentially become their new lord, collecting everything the king used to get.
Yes, it shows a shift in the flow of resources and authority from the state directly to the new landholder. This practice of land grants has sparked a major and heated debate among historians.
What's the debate about? What are the different interpretations?
There are different interpretations of the impact and purpose of these grants. One perspective sees them as a strategic move by ruling lineages to extend agriculture into new, uncultivated areas.
How would that work?
By granting land and the associated rights to religious institutions or brahmanas who might encourage settlement and cultivation, rulers could bring new land under the plow, ultimately expanding the agricultural base and, in theory, future potential revenue for the kingdom down the line.
So it's a way to develop new lands indirectly. What's the other side of the argument?
The opposing perspective interprets land grants as a sign of weakening political power on the part of the kings. They argue that rulers were losing direct fiscal and administrative control over their territories, perhaps becoming less able to collect taxes effectively.
So they gave away land rights because they couldn't collect the taxes themselves.
Possibly. By granting land and tax rights to religious institutions or brahmanas, they were essentially creating allies and projecting a facade of power, perhaps because they were losing real control on the ground to emerging powerful samatas. Giving away what they couldn't hold on to anyway, maybe.
So was it a strategy to strengthen the state by expanding agriculture, or a sign of the state weakening and decentralizing power by creating powerful, semi-independent landholders? Which is it?
It's a complex debate, and honestly, both dynamics might have been at play in different regions and at different times. What is clear is that land grants contributed significantly to the rise of new rural elites, the recipients of the grants who gained considerable control over land and the labor of the villagers living on it.
And thinking about the countryside, the source also reminds us that some groups of people were often beyond the reach of these state officials, samantas, or land grant recipients, people living outside the main system.
Yes, groups like pastoralists, fisherfolk, hunter-gatherers living in forests, mobile artisans, and shifting cultivators often inhabited areas or practiced livelihoods that didn't fit neatly into settled village structures based on intensive plow agriculture and state control.
And their histories are much harder to reconstruct, fewer records.
Significantly harder. These groups generally did not leave behind the kind of detailed written records like inscriptions or land grant documents that are so useful for studying settled agricultural societies or states. So reconstructing their experiences relies on more indirect evidence or rare mentions in texts written from the perspective of settled populations.
Right.
The excerpt from the Harshakarita, Source 7, a biography of King Harsha from the 7th century, which describes life on the outskirts of a forest settlement, mentioning spade culture and people gathering and trading forest produce, is valuable precisely because it offers one of these rare glimpses into the lives of people in areas less affected by intensive agriculture and state administration.
It really underscores that even with all the sources we've discussed, large segments of the population living differently from the settled farmers and town dwellers remain relatively silent in the historical record.
A constant reminder of the limitations of our sources.
We've explored the rise of states and significant changes in rural society. Now, let's turn our attention back to the urban centers, the towns and cities that really start to flourish from around the 6th century BCE onwards. What were they like?
These urban centers were vital nodes in the political, economic, and social landscape of the period. They weren't just places where kings lived. They were hubs of craft production, trade, and cultural activity. Bustling places.
And their location was absolutely critical to their success, you mentioned earlier. Location, location, location.
Paramount. Almost every major town or city from this period was strategically located along important communication routes. Whether it was a riverine route that allowed for easy transport by boat, an important overland trade route connecting different regions, or a coastal location serving sea routes, access to networks was key to a city's growth and prosperity.
Can you give us some examples of cities and their strategic locations again?
Sure. Pataliputra, as we discussed, commanded the major riverine routes along the Ganga. Ujjaini was strategically positioned along major land routes, crisscrossing central India. Puhar was an important coastal city on the southeastern coast, facilitating maritime trade. And cities like Mathura became major hubs, combining commercial, cultural, and political functions due to their nodal position on multiple routes.
And the history of a city itself can tell a story of the times, right? They weren't always stable.
No, they could be very dynamic. Pataliputra is a great example. It started as a small village called Pataligrama, then grew to become the capital of the powerful Magadhan kingdom, further expanding into the massive imperial capital of the Mauryas, arguably one of the largest cities in Asia at its peak. Yeah. But its fortunes changed. By the time the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang visited in the 7th century CE, he found it largely in ruins with a small population. This illustrates that urban centers weren't static. Their importance waxed and waned with political shifts, changes in trade routes, and other factors.
Who were the people who actually lived in these towns, beyond the ruling elites in their palaces?
While kings and ruling elites certainly resided in the fortified areas of the cities, the urban population was diverse. It included a wide range of people involved in various economic activities. Excavating ancient urban sites extensively can be challenging today because many are still inhabited, like parts of modern Patna built over Pataliputra.
Right, digging up a modern city is hard.
Exactly. However, archaeological finds and inscriptions provide us with glimpses.
What kind of archaeological finds tell us about Reuben life? What do we dig up?
Excavations yield a variety of artifacts. We find fine pottery, like the Northern Black Polished Ware, NBPW,
NDPW.
known for its distinctive glossy black finish, suggesting a certain level of luxury and likely used by wealthier urban residents. We also find a range of objects indicating craft production and consumption. Ornaments, tools, weapons, vessels, and figurines made from diverse materials: gold, silver, copper, bronze, ivory, glass, shell, and terracotta. These items paint a picture of urban wealth, sophisticated craftsmanship, and daily life.
And inscriptions help identify the people and their jobs. You mentioned votive inscriptions.
Crucially, yes. Short votive inscriptions dating from around the 2nd century BCE onwards are often found in cities, frequently on donated objects or parts of religious structures. These inscriptions often mention the name of the donor and, importantly, sometimes specify their occupation. This is a goldmine of information for understanding the social and economic composition of the urban population.
What kind of occupations do these inscriptions mention? Who lived in these cities?
They list a wide variety of professions, showing a diverse urban workforce. We hear about washing folk, weavers, scribes, carpenters, potters, goldsmiths.
Goldsmiths.
Figure 2.6, for instance, shows an inscription where Nagapiya, the wife of a goldsmith named Dharmaka, is recorded as donating an image. It gives a personal touch to these ancient occupations.
It does.
We also see blacksmiths, officials, religious teachers, merchants, and even kings making donations recorded in this way.
Were craft producers and merchants organized? Did they have groups or associations?
Yes, the sources mention guilds or shrinis. These were organizations of craft producers and merchants.
Shrinis.
Guilds played an important role in urban economies. They likely procured raw materials for their members, regulated production to maintain standards and quality, and facilitated the marketing of finished products. The increasing demand from growing urban populations and elites likely spurred craft production, with craftspersons using iron tools to produce goods efficiently.
These towns and cities weren't isolated islands. They were connected by extensive trade networks reaching far and wide.
Trade was a major engine of the economy during this period, connecting different parts of the subcontinent and linking the subcontinent to vast international networks. From the 6th century BCE, we see well-established land and riverine routes crisscrossing the Indian subcontinent, and these routes extended far beyond its borders.
Reaching where? How far did they go?
Overland routes connected North India through mountain passes to Central Asia and beyond. Think Silk Road connections. Riverine routes along the Ganga and other major rivers facilitated internal trade. And crucially, sea routes connected ports along the east and west coasts of India, across the Arabian Sea to East Africa and West Asia, and across the Bay of Bengal to Southeast Asia and China.
A huge interconnected world. Were these extensive routes controlled by the rulers? Did they tax the trade?
Rulers of the states and empires we discussed often sought to control these vital trade routes, recognizing their economic importance. They might have offered protection to traders and caravans, likely in exchange for levying tolls or taxes on the goods passing through their territory. Protection money, in a way.
Who are the people who traveled and facilitated this trade? Was it just big merchants?
The traders themselves ranged from small-scale peddlers, who might have traveled on foot selling goods in local areas, to large-scale merchants who organized caravans of bullock carts or pack animals for overland trade, or risked voyages across the seas.
Sea travel must have been risky.
Seafaring could be very risky, facing storms and piracy, but it could also be incredibly profitable due to the high value of certain goods.
And some of these merchants became very wealthy and influential, right?
Yes, successful long-distance traders could accumulate considerable wealth and social standing. The source mentions terms used for wealthy merchants in different languages. Masatuhan in Tamil texts and Sathis and Satavahas in Prakrit texts. These individuals likely played a significant role in urban life and patronage.
What kind of goods were being exchanged across these networks? What were they trading?
A huge range of goods were traded. This included bulk items like salt and grain moving over shorter distances or along rivers, as well as more valuable items traveling longer distances. Raw materials like metal ores, stone, and timber were traded, as were finished products like cloth, metalwares, and ornaments. Highly valued luxury goods included medicinal plants and famously spices, particularly pepper from the south.
Pepper. And there was significant international demand for Indian goods, especially from the West, from Rome.
Absolutely. There was particularly high demand from the Roman Empire for Indian spices, fine textiles, and medicinal plants. These goods were transported across the Arabian Sea and then overland, or by sea within the Roman network, forming a lucrative trade relationship.
The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, Seuss 9, gives us a remarkable eyewitness account of this maritime trade. What is that text?
This text is invaluable. It was written by an anonymous Greek-speaking sailor who traveled in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea region around the 1st century CE. It's essentially a trade guide.
A travel guide for traders.
Pretty much. Describing the ports, goods, and trading conditions along the coastlines, including the Malabar coast in present-day Kerala.
What does the Periplus tell us about the trade on the Malabar coast? What was coming in and going out?
It provides detailed lists of imports and exports for specific ports. For the markets of the Malabar coast, it lists significant imports, including a great quantity of coin, suggesting a positive trade balance for the Indian side in terms of monetary inflow.
So gold and silver flowing into India.
Seems like it, along with luxury and strategic goods like topaz, antimony, a mineral used as a cosmetic and medicine, coral, crude glass, copper, tin, and lead.
And what were they exporting from that region? What did the Romans want?
From the Malabar coast, the Periplus highlights the export of pepper, noting it was produced in quantity in only one region near these markets. Other valuable exports included fine pearls, ivory, silk cloth, various transparent stones like diamonds and sapphires, and tortoiseshell, prized for ornaments.
Pepper, pearls, ivory, silk, high-value goods. And the source connects this text to archaeological evidence on the ground.
Yes, the mention of precious and transparent stones in the Periplus aligns beautifully with archaeological evidence from inland sites like Kodamanal in Tamil Nadu, where a significant bead-making industry using semi-precious stones has been excavated.
Ah, so they were making beads inland and shipping them out from the coast?
It suggests inland centers of production were supplying valuable raw materials or finished goods to the coastal ports mentioned by the Greek sailor for export in this extensive trade network. The author likely compiled this list as a practical guide for other traders, detailing what goods were available where, making it a valuable historical source on trade flows.
All this commercial activity, both within the subcontinent and internationally, was greatly facilitated by the increasing use of coins. Money makes trade easier.
Coinage played a vital role in simplifying and standardizing economic exchange beyond simple barter. The earliest coins found in India are the punch-marked coins, figure 2.7.
Punch-marked coins.
These are typically made of silver or copper and date from around the 6th century BCE onwards.
They get their name from the symbols literally punched onto the metal blanks, right? Not cast or struck like later coin.
Exactly. They have been found over a very wide geographical area. Numismatists, the scholars who specialize in the study of coins, analyze the composition, weight, and symbols on these coins to try and reconstruct commercial networks and the regions where they circulated.
Who do historians think issued these early punch-marked coins? Was it the kings or someone else?
That's debated. Attempts have been made to link the symbols found on some of these coins to specific ruling dynasties, such as the Mauryas, suggesting that states issued some of them to standardize currency.
Oh,
However, it's also considered likely that powerful merchants, bankers, and perhaps even town corporations or guilds also issued these coins, reflecting a degree of decentralized economic authority alongside state power.
so maybe not just the state controlling money. And then we see a shift to coins bearing the images and names of rulers.
A significant development, yeah. The first coins to clearly bear the names and images of the rulers who issued them were introduced by the Indo-Greek kings who ruled the Northwest from around the 2nd century BCE. Figure 2.12 shows a coin of the Indo-Greek king Menander, clearly depicting his portrait and name.
Like the ones used to decipher Korosti.
Exactly. This practice was then adopted by subsequent dynasties in the region and elsewhere.
And gold coins appear prominently with the Kushanas. When was that?
Yes, the Kushanas, who ruled in the Northwest and Central Asia, were the first to issue gold coins on a significant scale, starting around the 1st century CE.
Kushana gold.
These gold coins were notably virtually identical in weight to the contemporary Roman and Parthian gold coins,
Wow, same weight.
highlighting the interconnectedness of these major economic zones. The widespread discovery of Kushana gold coins across North India and Central Asia indicates that transactions of enormous value were taking place, likely associated with the control and facilitation of long-distance trade routes, particularly the Silk Road and its branches.
And the discovery of Roman coins in India provides even more direct evidence of that long-distance connection.
Absolutely. Significant hoards of Roman coins have been found in South India. While South India was outside the Roman Empire politically, these coin finds provide tangible archaeological evidence of the extensive trade connections that existed across the Indian Ocean, linking regions far beyond their respective political boundaries. Trade trumping politics.
Other groups also issued coins, not just the big empires.
Yes, various other ruling entities issued their own coinage, indicating their participation in the wider economy. For example, tribal republics, such as the Audhyas in present-day Punjab and Haryana around the 1st century CE, issued numerous copper coins. Figure 2.8 shows a Audhya coin. The discovery of thousands of these copper coins suggests their wide circulation and indicates that these tribal groups were active participants in economic exchange networks.
And the Gupta period saw the issue of some particularly impressive gold coins, too, later on.
Yes, the Gupta rulers issued some truly spectacular gold coins, figure 2.9, often celebrated for their artistic quality and the purity of the metal in their early issues. These coins facilitated large-scale, long-distance transactions, and the Gupta kings undoubtedly benefited significantly from the flourishing trade and economic activity that they represented and facilitated.
The source mentions a debate among historians about the significance of gold coin finds tapering off from around the 6th century CE. Fewer gold coins found after that.
This is another area of active discussion, yeah. Finds of gold coins, particularly Gupta ones, seem to become less common after around the 6th century CE. Some historians interpret this as a sign of economic crisis or decline during this later period,
Why? What would cause that?
perhaps linked to external factors like the decline of the Western Roman Empire, which reduced demand for Indian goods and disrupted lucrative trade routes. Less international trade, less gold coming in or circulating.
But there's an alternative interpretation. It wasn't necessarily a decline.
Yes. Other historians argue that the decrease in hoarded gold coins doesn't necessarily indicate a decline in the overall economy. They point to the continued mention of coins in inscriptions and texts from this later period. They also highlight the emergence of new towns and trade networks within the subcontinent around this time.
Suggesting the coins were still in use, just not being buried in hoards, maybe circulating more.
That's the argument that coins might have been circulating more actively within these newer, perhaps more regional trade networks and urban centers, rather than being accumulated and buried in hoards for safekeeping, as might have happened in earlier periods or different contexts. So, fewer finds might reflect a change in economic behavior or circulation patterns rather than an economic collapse.
It's a debate that requires careful consideration of all the available evidence. Very interesting.
It really highlights that the economic picture, like the political one, was incredibly dynamic, driven by trade involving a huge range of goods and people across vast distances, facilitated by coinage, but with ongoing questions about the nature of economic shifts over time.
Precisely. And it raises questions about what the sources tell us about trade transactions themselves. We see evidence of the movement of goods, the use of coins for payment, and systems of gifts or tribute in kind. But details about the micro level, how daily market transactions occurred or the specific ways prices were negotiated, those kinds of details are much harder to come by in these sources.
The everyday details are often lost.
Which brings us back to the essential point. How do historians actually work with these sources? We've been talking about deciphered inscriptions, ancient texts, coins, but the process of extracting history from them is far from simple, especially for the ancient scripts. It's real detective work.
Not at all simple. It's a meticulous and complex craft, often involving collaborative effort. We've touched on James Prinsep's momentous breakthrough, but let's look closer at the epigraphist's job, the scholar who studies inscriptions.
Deciphering Brahmi sounds like a monumental task, given it's the ancestor of so many modern scripts used in India and Southeast Asia.
It was indeed. The process involved European scholars collaborating closely with Indian pandits who possessed deep knowledge of later Indian scripts like Bengali and Devanagari. By comparing the forms of letters in contemporary or near-contemporary manuscripts with the older shapes found in inscriptions, they could work backward,
Right, like we said before.
looking for evolutionary links and recurring patterns. Figure 2.11 vividly illustrates these visual similarities between Brahmi and Devanagari letters.
And they made an initial assumption about the language that turned out to be incorrect, right? They thought it was Sanskrit.
Yes, initially many European scholars assumed that Sanskrit was the language of these earliest inscriptions, as it was the classical language of learning and religion. It took decades of dedicated work, building on partial identifications, before James Prinsep in 1838 definitively identified the language of the Asokan inscriptions as Prakrit, which was key to completing the decipherment of Brahmi.
The story of reading Kharosthi was different because of those bilingual coins from the Northwest. That was the key there.
Exactly. The Indo-Greek coins found in the Northwest, like the one of Menander in figure 2.12, provided a direct key. They had the king's name and titles in Greek, which was readable, and in the unknown Kharosthi script.
So you match the sounds.
Scholars who knew Greek could compare the sequences of letters in the Greek names with the symbols in the Kharosthi script on the same coin. This allowed them to identify specific letters, for example, finding the A symbol in multiple names that contained that sound in Greek. Once Prinsep confirmed that the language was Prakrit, similar to the Brahmi inscriptions, the ability to read Kharosthi texts quickly expanded.
Once an inscription is deciphered, the work isn't over. How do historians use these texts as historical evidence? And what are the challenges? The source looks at two Asokan inscription examples to illustrate this process. Let's dig into those.
Right, let's take source 10, which is titled The Orders of the King. This inscription, characteristic of many Asokan edicts, doesn't actually mention the name Asoka. It refers to the ruler by his titles Devanampya and Piyadasi, meaning beloved of the gods and pleasant to behold.
So, how do epigraphists confidently attribute this inscription to Asoka if his name isn't even on it?
They do this through meticulous comparison across multiple inscriptions. By examining all the inscriptions found using these titles and noting the consistent content, style, language, Prakrit, and paleography, the specific style of writing.
Paleography, the handwriting style, basically.
Exactly, the specific way the letters are formed. Epigraphists conclude they were all issued by the same ruler. Crucially, some of these inscriptions, while using the titles, also explicitly name this king as Asoka. This cross-referencing allows them to confirm that the vast majority of inscriptions using these titles belong to Asoka.
Okay, makes sense. The inscription also contains a specific claim made by the king about previous rulers. What does he say?
Yes, Asoka claims in source 10 that in the past there were no arrangements for disposing affairs nor for receiving regular reports. He then describes the system he has put in place, appointing officials called Patavadakas, or reporters, whose duty it is to report to him regularly about the affairs of the people, even when he is engaged in personal activities like eating or sleeping. He wants reports anytime, anywhere.
As a historian, do you just accept Asoka's claim that no rulers before him had such arrangements? Seems like a bold claim.
This is where critical historical analysis comes in. We don't take him at face value. We consider whether a claim like this is likely to be literally true, plausible, or perhaps an exaggeration, or a way for Asoka to emphasize his own innovation, efficiency, and commitment to his subjects compared to his predecessors.
Right, making himself look good.
Possibly. Given that earlier states like the Mahajanapadas existed and certainly needed information to function, it's unlikely there's no system of reporting at all. But maybe Ahsoka's system was unprecedented in its scope, formality, or the direct accessibility of the ruler to these reports. It requires assessing the claim within the broader context of what we know about earlier periods.
The source also highlights the epigraphist's use of brackets in the translations of these inscriptions. Why do they do that?
Yes, you'll notice in translations that some words or phrases are enclosed in brackets. Epigraphists use these brackets to indicate words that are either missing from the original inscription due to damage or erosion, or words that have been added by the translator to clarify the meaning of a sentence where the phrasing is ambiguous or very terse in the original Prakrit.
So it's to show where they've filled in a blank or added a word for clarity.
Exactly. It's necessary work to make the text readable, but they must be extremely careful not to insert their own interpretations or unintentionally alter the intended meaning of the original author. Transparency is key.
And how might the function of Ahsoka's Padavadakas differ from, say, modern journalists or reporters? They're both called reporters.
Good question. Modern reporters gather information and then disseminate it publicly, aiming to inform the general public, ideally holding power accountable. Ahsoka's Padavadakas seem to have had a different role. They were internal reporters.
Reporting to the king, not about the king.
Exactly. Gathering information from various parts of the empire, from officials or potentially directly from the people, but their primary function was to report to the king. Their purpose was to keep the ruler informed about the state of affairs, enabling him to make decisions and intervene as needed. It was about the ruler's access to information for governance, not about public information dissemination.
Beyond just the text, does the location of the inscription matter? Where they put these pillars and rocks?
Absolutely. Where an inscription is placed is crucial for interpretation. If a king's orders were inscribed on a rock near a busy road or a city center, the intention was likely to reach a specific audience, or at least be seen by many.
Right.
However, it also raises questions about how widely understood they were. Most people were likely not literate. Even if they could read, would a common person from a distant region understand the specific dialect of Prakrit used in the imperial capital? And would the king's orders, even if understood, be uniformly followed everywhere across the vast empire? These are important questions that the mere existence of the inscription doesn't automatically answer.
Another Ahsokan inscription, Source 11, which talks about the Kalinga conquest, presents particularly complex interpretive challenges. This is a famous one.
This inscription is incredibly powerful and often cited as evidence of Ahsoka's personal transformation. In it, he describes the immense suffering caused by his conquest of Kalinga, the casualties, the hundreds of thousands killed, deported, or left to die.
Horrific numbers.
He expresses deep remorse and anguish over the violence and suffering, stating that it caused him great pain and regret, and that this experience led to his profound devotion to Dhamma. It seems to offer a direct insight into the emperor's conscience and a turning point in his reign.
But there's a crucial piece of the puzzle missing from the location where the events actually happened. Where's the inscription in Kalinga?
Yes, this is the interpretive problem. Despite Ahsokan inscriptions being found throughout his empire, including in present-day Orissa, which was ancient Kalinga, the specific inscription detailing his anguish and remorse over the Kalinga conquest is missing from the Kalinga region itself.
That's very strange. Why wouldn't he put the apology basically where the war happened? What could that mean?
This absence has led to various interpretations and historical debate. Does it mean that the memory of the conquest was still too raw and painful for Ahsoka to inscribe that specific message in the conquered territory? Maybe too insulting to the locals?
Possibly.
Or does its presence in other parts of the empire, but not in Kalinga, suggest that this expression of remorse was perhaps more strategically aimed at audiences elsewhere, intended to project an image of a changed, more benevolent ruler, or to justify his new focus on Dhamma to subjects who might have questioned the shift away from traditional warfare and expansion?
So maybe it was more about managing his image elsewhere than about expressing remorse to the victims.
It's a possibility historians have to consider. It forces us to look beyond the literal meaning of the text and consider the purpose, audience, and historical context of its creation and placement. Looking at Map 2 and seeing the distribution of Ahsokan inscriptions, often along major trade routes or near important administrative centers, suggests a deliberate, strategic placement intended to reach specific populations or areas crucial for the empire's functioning.
It really highlights that working with these ancient sources isn't just about translation. It's a complex process of interpretation, contextualization, and debate. Reading between the lines or maybe reading the silences.
Exactly. The absence can be as revealing as the presence.
So we've seen how invaluable inscriptions are, especially those of Ahsoka, but you've also highlighted that even epigraphy, the study of inscriptions, has its limitations. It's not a perfect window.
Definitely not. As with any historical source, inscriptions don't provide a complete or perfect picture, and they come with inherent challenges. Firstly, there are technical issues. Over centuries, inscriptions can become faintly engraved, damaged by weather or human activity, or parts might be entirely missing due to breakage or erosion. Reconstructing the original text from these fragments can be uncertain.
Guessing letters and words.
Sometimes, yes, and the language itself can be tricky, even after decipherment. Even when the script is deciphered, the exact meaning of certain words or phrases can be difficult to determine, especially if they are local terms specific to a particular region or era that don't appear elsewhere.
Right.
This leads to ongoing debate among scholars, which you can see reflected in epigraphical journals where alternative readings and interpretations are constantly discussed.
We only have a fraction of what was originally created. Most inscriptions are probably lost forever.
That's a key point of survival bias. While thousands of inscriptions have been found, it's certain that many, many more were created on perishable materials like wood or cloth, or on stone that has since been lost, destroyed, or remains undiscovered. So what we have access to is likely only a partial record of the original inscriptional landscape.
Beyond these technical and survival issues, there are more fundamental problems with relying solely on inscriptions for history. What gets recorded and whose story gets told.
Yes. These relate to what was chosen to be recorded and whose perspective is represented. There's a significant selection bias. Inscriptions tend to record grand, unique events, a king's conquests, the construction of major buildings, large donations for religious institutions.
That's the big stuff.
They are less likely to mention routine, everyday occurrences, things like typical agricultural practices, the texture of daily life, the joys and sorrows of ordinary people. These are rarely deemed important enough to be carved in stone. Not everything that was historically significant or representative of broader societal life was recorded.
And as you mentioned with the Prashastas, there's a clear perspective bias. It's the official story, usually.
Absolutely. The content of inscriptions almost invariably reflects the perspective and intentions of the person or entity who commissioned it, usually the ruler, a wealthy donor, or a religious institution. It's a presentation intended to convey a certain image, legitimize authority, or record a pious act. It is not and should not be treated as an objective, neutral historical record of events or society.
So inscriptions are incredibly valuable, but they can't tell the whole story on their own. You need other sources.
Precisely. To build a fuller, more nuanced picture of political and economic history, inscriptions must always be juxtaposed and compared with other types of sources, ancient texts, religious, literary, administrative, archaeological finds, settlements, artifacts, coins, and accounts from foreign visitors. Combining evidence from different sources allows historians to cross-validate information, identify biases, and fill in the gaps that any single source type leaves open.
And the way historians approach these sources and the questions they ask have evolved over time, haven't they? History isn't static.
Yes, history is a dynamic field. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the primary interest, as we saw, was often in reconstructing the political histories of kings and dynasties, and inscriptions were central to this.
Kings and battles.
Pretty much. From the mid-20th century, the focus broadened significantly to include economic changes, social structures, and understanding different groups within society. More recently, there's been a growing emphasis on trying to uncover the histories and experiences of marginalized groups who left behind fewer conventional records.
And this shift in focus means looking at the same old sources with new eyes and new questions, trying to find clues about different people.
Exactly. It often requires re-examining existing inscriptions, texts, and archaeological evidence with different analytical strategies, trying to glean information about those previously overlooked segments of the population or aspects of life. It shows that the past isn't just a fixed story waiting to be discovered. It's constantly being re-evaluated and understood in new ways as historians develop new questions and methods.
So we've traveled through 1,000 years of truly incredible transformation in the Indian subcontinent, from the scattered settlements and regional developments following the decline of Harappa, through the emergence of powerful Mahajanapadas, the vast reach of the Mauryan Empire, the subsequent rise of new kingdoms and diverse chiefdoms. And alongside all of this, evolving economies driven by intensified agriculture and sophisticated trade networks that link the subcontinent not just internally, but across vast distances to Central Asia, Africa, and Southeast Asia. It's a huge story.
And we've seen how this complex story is pieced together by historians acting as detectives, carefully working with disparate sources, from the foundational act of deciphering ancient scripts on stone to interpreting the narratives in ancient texts, analyzing the stories told by coins and archaeological finds, and constantly grappling with the challenges and biases inherent in all of them.
It's so much more than just reading old writings. It's about the meticulous craft of decipherment, the careful comparison of different sources, the critical assessment of biases and perspectives, and the ongoing debate about interpretations.
The work of historical reconstruction is never truly finished. It's about building the most comprehensive and nuanced picture possible from the fragments that time has left us.
As we wrap up this deep dive, it leaves us with the question, why does understanding this ancient period matter to us today? Why should we care about kings and farmers from 2,000 years ago?
Well, I think it matters because understanding how these early states and complex economies were built, the challenges rulers faced in governing diverse territories, how ordinary people adapted to changing agricultural practices and urban life, and how vibrant trade networks connected distant lands. All of this gives us a deeper appreciation for the complex and dynamic roots of Indian civilization.
Right.
It speaks to enduring human questions about power, social organization, economic life, and the challenges of governing and living together across vast and diverse landscapes. These are themes that still resonate.
It truly is a dive into the foundations of a major civilization that continues to resonate. And reflecting on the sources we've used, it leaves us with a powerful final thought, doesn't it? About whose voices we hear.
Yes. Despite the wealth of sources like inscriptions, texts commissioned by elites, and coins associated with rulers and wealthy merchants, the voices and the daily lived experiences of ordinary people, the vast majority who cultivated the fields, performed manual labor, crafted goods, or lived on the margins of settled society, often remain largely silent in the historical record.
That silence is deafening sometimes. What does that pervasive silence tell us about history itself?
It tells us that much of the history that has survived, particularly from ancient periods, was created and preserved by the powerful, by those with the means, the literacy, and the motivation to leave lasting records of their world, their achievements, and their perspective.
History written by the winners, or at least the writers.
To a large extent, yes. And it raises an important question for us as listeners and learners of history. What are we missing when we primarily rely on the records left by the kings, the elites, and the institutions? And how can we, even indirectly, try to hear the echoes of those quieter, less documented lives? It's a question that continues to drive historical inquiry, and one worth pondering long after our deep dive ends.